One possible point in favor of antinatalism is that it's unnecessary to bring anyone into existence, and that therefore the harm and risk imposed on those who come into existence is unnecessary. A very helpful definition of need comes from the philosopher Feinberg, who defines a need essentially as that without which one is harmed. And so food is a need because without it we're harmed. And it's also clear from this, I think, that coming into existence is not a need because no one is harmed by never coming into existence. Now, assuming that this is true, we might consider an argument like this. It is wrong to impose an unnecessary risk on another. Procreation does impose such a risk on another, and so procreation is wrong. And I suspect most people would agree that it is wrong to subject another to risk when it is unnecessary to do so. So, for example, imagine a risky operation performed on human infants, the sole purpose of which is to give these humans superhuman vision, the ability to see a lot better than ordinary human beings. Now, if the operation fails, the one who undergoes it will live with eye pain for most of their life. I think most people would oppose this and would do so on the grounds that it's inappropriate to impose this sort of risk on someone in the absence of any serious need. A procreation similarly involves imposing an unnecessary risk. It is always possible that the child will lead a miserable life. But one objection to this line of argument, something that was recently pointed out in a comment, is that although procreation is unnecessary from the point of view of merely possible beings, it is arguably necessary from the point of view of already existing beings. And this is because existing beings depend on new generations to run and maintain vital aspects of society. So if a sufficient number of people decided not to reproduce, this might mean harm for existing beings. And so the claim that procreation is unnecessary can be disputed in this way. Plus, what I would say to this sort of objection is this, that voluntary extinction, or something close enough to it, seems to me is really only a theoretical concern, not a practical concern. Because after all, based on what we know about human behavior, human nature, it seems very unlikely that humans as a species will affect its own end voluntarily. And since there will probably always be a sufficiently large portion of the population that does reproduce, it's completely unnecessary for those who do agree with antinatalism in every generation to reproduce. And so there's nothing sort of paradoxical in saying we should encourage everyone not to have children, and of course not have children ourselves, while recognizing that we needn't worry about the possible situation in which this ideal is achieved. But even if we assume that this ideal will be achieved and would make life worse for the last generation or generations, I think one could still say that any additional harm incurred by these final generations would ultimately be outweighed by the harm that would thereby be prevented for many more generations. But moreover, since we are considering here extinction by voluntary means, this harm or risk of harm will be something that these last generations will have agreed to accept in some sense. And the significance of this, it seems to me, is twofold. One is that if the last generation is taking it upon itself to do this, it's likely that they've prepared themselves in some way for this event. And so we can perhaps expect that the harm will not be as great as if they hadn't prepared for it. And second, even if the cost for the last generation is considerable, one might argue that the last generation is not wronged in any way if they are in fact accepting this harm voluntarily. Again, I do regard this, at least at the moment, as a purely theoretical discussion, though I do think objections like these are both interesting and important to reflect on.